Well, it's the feast of St. Nicholas, so happy St. Nicholas feast day to one and all. It's also the 100th anniversary of the Halifax Explosion. Now, you've probably never heard of the Halifax Explosion unless you grew up in Canada and saw one of those heritage commercials that we all grew up watching about the Halifax Explosion. At the outset, let me say it's the largest man-made blast or explosion or disaster before the atom bombs were dropped at the order of Truman on the Japanese in 1945. In fact, the scientists like Robert Oppenheimer, who developed the atom bomb, studied carefully the Halifax explosion because it's the closest analog to the destruction they wanted to achieve with the atom bomb. So I think the best way to compress what happened that day is to start with two ships, the ships that eventually collided. One is the Emo, which was a Norwegian-registered ship carrying Belgian relief. In fact, it said Belgian relief on the side in English in huge red font. It was leaving Halifax Harbor, bound for New York as a stopover, and then it was going to cross the Atlantic because World War I was raging. The Allies were desperate for munitions for their guns against the Kaiser. People in Belgium were literally starving to death. So the Emo, while it was empty in the harbor before it went to New York, it was meant to fill up there and then cross the Atlantic. Meanwhile, also in New York, on December 5th, a French vessel called the Mont Blanc, White Mountain, left Gravesend Bay, New York, loaded with a cargo that very few people in this world knew what was on it. The Admiralty knew, the captain knew, and obviously the crew that loaded it. An unspeakably dangerous mix of TNT and picric acid, which was used in ammunition during World War I, and benzol, gun cotton, really a satanic cargo hold of ammunition. In fact, it was a floating bomb. It was so slow in the water that the Navy informed the captain, whose name was Aimé Lemedec, you're not going to get a convoy, you're on your own. So these French patriots loaded the ship in New York, Gravesend Bay, which is around the corner, not far from JFK Airport. And they loaded the ship, and it took 5 days to sail from New York to Halifax. And on the morning of December 6th, the Emo was delayed by a day. It was supposed to leave on the 5th, but there was a miscommunication with the coal, and so it got delayed. And the Norwegian captain, Håkon From, was not happy about this, but there's nothing they could do about it. So around 7 o'clock in the morning, 7:30 or so, the Emo starts heading from Bedford Basin to the open sea. Now, Halifax Harbor is designed in a unique way. The basin is about 12 miles long. It's a huge heart-shaped inlet. And between that inlet, or that bay, and the open sea is a very narrow stretch of water called the Narrows between Halifax and Dartmouth, even though they're now called a different collective city. Halifax and Dartmouth are the twin cities where this event happened. So the Emo was coming down harbor toward the sea. The Mont Blanc is going up harbor because it was late the night before. The two submarine nets were shut, and they had to also wait a day. So now the stage is set for what happened. On a clear morning, December 6th, with no obvious traffic except for a few scows and ferries crossing back and forth, there was a terrible game of chicken that began to be played, and an argument as the ships grew closer over who had the right-of-way. Now, I don't have time to go into that dispute, but that's what the court case later was meant to resolve. Whose responsibility was it for these ships colliding? So at about 8:35, they do collide, and it was one of those, you stop, no, you stop, you stop. Anyway, disaster was not averted, and the Emo plunged straight into the cargo hold near the bow of the Mont Blanc. They reversed their engines on the Emo, and as that bow was leaving the vessel's side holds, sparks flew because of the friction. This started a fire. The fire raged, got hotter and hotter and hotter. The Emo drifted back toward the Dartmouth side of the shore, and the Mont Blanc was now a burning inferno, seconds away from igniting. And the only people who knew what was about to happen was the crew. They abandoned ship, and they were yelling at people, "Get out of the way, this is, full of ammunition, it's going to explode, she's going to blow." Either they didn't hear the crew, or the crew didn't, or the surrounding people didn't understand a lot of French. And at 9:06 a.m., inches from pier number 6 in Halifax, in a fraction of a second, the Mont Blanc exploded in an unspeakable blast. Several hundred feet was with the temperature many times the surface of the sun temperature. Buildings were incinerated. An earthquake was set off. Teacups shook hundreds of miles away in Prince Edward Island. There was a tsunami from the blast. Just under 2,000 people were killed. 10,000 were injured. About 25,000 people in the city had damaged homes or were homeless. So the Halifax explosion was a terrible reminder that when war happens on the other side of the world, things can still happen in the homeland. The city of Boston and the medical crew there assisted the Canadian physicians and nurses staff who worked day and night for like 54-hour shifts trying to help the injured. All the hospitals were swamped within an hour. For their kindness in responding quickly to this disaster, the people of Nova Scotia each Christmas to this day give a fir tree from Nova Scotia forests to the people of Boston to thank them for their courageous and generous response in helping Halifax back up on her feet. So that's the Halifax explosion. So why am I sharing this with you? Well, I'm oddly tied up with this event, and I've got my East Coast, all right, Nova Scotia t-shirt and my Tim Hortons coffee mug here in honor of the day, and prayers for those who lost their lives, and also prayers for first responders today who saved so many lives. We don't think about first responders, but they're also true heroes. Well, that day on Duffus Street, which was less than a quarter of a mile from where the ships blew up, the Mont Blanc ship blew up, was a man named Hector McKinnon. Hector worked for the Canadian National Railroad, and his line was between Halifax and Montreal. That morning, he got off the train. He had done a night shift. He noticed the ship on fire, noticed all the kids gathering to watch. It was like Christmas before Christmas. It was like fireworks. There were canisters of Benzol on the deck that were going up in flames, shooting up off the deck of the ship. No one really knew what was going on. They certainly didn't know what was about to hit them. Hector walks up Duffus Street, 35 Duffus, says hi to his wife Marguerite. They have breakfast. They have 3 small children under the age of 5. And at 9:06, the explosion destroyed their house by way of the tsunami, the so-called tidal wave that rushed across the city, along with the satanic vortex of body parts and bricks and glass and telephone wires and train parts and just all manner of flotsam and jetsam scattered itself across the city as part of the blast zone. Hector's wife, Marguerite, and their kids were killed. Their bodies were never recovered, probably washed out to sea by the wave, as many were. Hector helped do what he could to help the other victims who had suffered far worse. One family lost 16 close family members in that disaster. A few years later, Hector moved on. What could he do? He moved on with his life and got married again. His second wife's name is Mary. And from Mary, Hector produced 6 more daughters. The youngest daughter's name is Marion McKinnon. And in 1960, Marion McKinnon married Jack Coffin, my father. So when I was telling this story to my children, halfway through when they were just little, they said, "Wait a second, Daddy. If that ship hadn't blown up, if those delays hadn't happened, if there was no disaster, we wouldn't be here to hear this story, because you wouldn't be here to tell it, because Nana wouldn't even be here." That's right. So I've grown up in the strange metaphysical shadow of the Halifax explosion. A lot of good has come. Medical advances. The Canadian Institute for the Blind was formed in 1918 as a result of the blast. 1 in 50 people in Halifax suffered terrible eye injuries from the firestorm of glass that blew its way through the city. Think of all the people watching those barrels go off in their homes, looking out their windows. Dozens were blinded. In fact, the scalpels became dull from so many eye excisions. There were buckets full of eyes lost through this terrible, terrible explosion. The casualty of war. War kills a lot more people than combatants. Halifax Explosion is Exhibit A. And yet, disasters like that can produce good. Family trees are changed, and people exist that would never have existed but for that day. Hundreds and hundreds of people on both sides of both families that were there that day are changed forever. So remember the wounded who survived and those who were victims of the disaster. Pray for their souls and pray for first responders today who do such an amazing job at cleaning up disasters, whether natural or man-made. This is Patrick Coffin. Enjoy my podcast, The Patrick Coffin Show. Subscribe, rate, and review. The website is patrickcoffin.media. Have a blessed rest of your St. Nicholas feast day. And be a saint. What else is there?